For example, for all of everyone billeted at Fort Meade, you have to have special authority for them to be able to go in the scene and have a conversation with somebody from the other.
So there's a whole bunch of complications. We're not subject to
I don't know whether
all
you have
those.
that kind of same problem.
Not really. I mean, if there's an actual RCP.
All right, good morning.
Complications, but otherwise.
I'd like to try and get started. I'm mindful that our panel is what sits between you and your lunch. So I'd like to just get started, try and keep things interesting and hopefully satiating as well. My name is Avi Cover. I teach here at the law school in the Civil Rights and Human Rights Clinic, and I'm also the director of the Institute for Global Security Law and Policy. I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel on cybersecurity. We have with us remotely from Tbilisi, Georgia, Scott Shackelford. Hopefully, Scott, can you hear us?
Yes, I sure can. Can you hear me okay?
We can. Terrifically. All right, good. Good.
Yes.
Excellent. Scott is a professor of business law and ethics at Indiana University's Kelley School of Business. He teaches cybersecurity, international business law, and sustainability, among other courses. We have, to my far right, Peter Hammerschmidt, who is the Director General of the National Cybersecurity Directorate, Public Safety of Canada. Next to him, we have David Thaw. David is a professor at Pittsburgh, both in the law school and in information sciences, and an affiliated fellow of the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. And finally, closest to me here is Catherine Lotrianti. Catherine is the director of the Institute for Law, Science, and Global Security, and a professor of government service at Georgetown. Last month, the U.S. Office of the Director of National Intelligence issued its annual worldwide threat assessment of the U.S. intelligence community. Ranking as the number one global threat, very appropriate for our panel, was cyber. Indeed, it has ranked as the worldwide number one threat for the past 4 years. But as Professor Amy Ziegard has pointed out, just 8 years ago, 2007, it didn't even rank amongst one of the worldwide considered threats by the intelligence community. So what has happened? Perhaps it doesn't take the DNI to see that a variety, thousands really, of attacks on private industry, including a multitude of data and identity thefts of intellectual property, indicate that cybersecurity is a significant economic and security problem. It raises concerns when one uses the internet, swipes his or her Target department store card, or perhaps even just shares information health data. The economic costs of cybersecurity attacks are enormous, ranking perhaps as high as over $500 billion annually. It's also a democratic problem. As we have seen, countries such as North Korea have an impact on our free speech, even when that is simply a mediocre bromance issued by Sony Pictures. And it's a national security problem, an international law problem, as we see attacks sponsored, whether we acknowledge it, the United States, China, Israel, North Korea, and Russia. And certainly there are covert arrangements with criminal enterprises, with non-state actors. And these invoke in some people's minds the need for we are in the midst of a cyber arms race that does need controls. So what to do? That is what our panel is here for today. I'm going to turn it over to them. I think perhaps the best way to begin, maybe with you, David, is to give us a sense of what we mean when we talk about cybersecurity, sort of as a just primary definitional first principle issue.
Thank you, Avi. And I think this is an excellent place to start and an excellent question with which to sort of frame one of the largest problems that we face when trying to address cybersecurity challenges is that we throw around this term, and I say we collectively, not just everyone in this room, but collectively society, and probably means somewhere on the order of about 500 different things at my last count when we use it. So what I want to do is suggest ways of thinking about what are some of the different pieces, all of which could be described as cybersecurity, so that we can break out the discussion in an effective way which may lead to the possibility for operational solutions. And there are two metrics that I would suggest we consider. The first is a spectrum between, again, this is from a defensive perspective, what we consider defense against military and then other government public into private infrastructure and other private, being the far end of the spectrum, enterprises, institutions, organizations. There is a big difference between what Home Depot defends against and what the United States Department of Defense defends against. And the second metric is in different industrial sectors. The healthcare sector is worried about something in the consumer products sector. The finance sector is worried about something different than the nuclear energy sector. So how do we break this out in a meaningful way? A couple of comments. First, it's very easy to focus on military and defense definitions because we have a great deal of expertise. This is not a new area within the military defense and even the defense industrial complex. It has new aspects to it, certainly, but it's not lacking expertise. But it's dangerously incomplete to look only there. And it's dangerously incomplete to look only there because what private organizations do, particularly those that operate critical infrastructure, is a different task. Google has a different set of objectives and was founded with a different set of objectives than the United States Department of Defense or any foreign defense ministry of which I'm aware. I would challenge anyone to sort of find a way to square the two of those objectives together. Google's a company. It's a profit-making enterprise. I'd also challenge you to think about whether or not Google is critical infrastructure. And the definition I usually give is what would happen right now if all of Google and Apple in this room, how would you all feel? I imagine somewhere around the order of 90% of you would feel completely off. I see we have at least one person in uniform. That may be the one person who has some type of resilience in their system in this room. I would not. And it's not by choice or by risk definition. I don't have an option available that isn't provided by a private company. So we have to think about what these things mean. And there are two sort of distinctions I would draw to conclude how we should think about separating these. First is that the military and intelligence model is more of a directive risk prevention model. If you go all the way back to the concept of protecting sensitive communications, you'll go all the way to using Native American code talkers to create near, if not complete, one-time pads for the security folks in the room. These are extremely strong security measures to defend classified communications. Ask Google to do that for every single one of its hundreds of millions, if not billions of users. And they're going to say, we'll be out of business in about 20 seconds because they're a business. They're not set up to engage in risk prevention. They're set up to engage in risk mitigation to achieve reasonable security. Private organizations are designed to accommodate business judgment. The expertise we bring from military and intelligence organizations is designed to achieve and accommodate the necessity of enforcing certain levels regardless of the cost. Those two don't always mesh together well. And as we consider what is cybersecurity, it's important to understand and respect these distinctions so that we don't try to apply the same standards and the same patterns of thinking to both.
Thanks, David. That's a really helpful beginning and approach. So taking into account there are, of course, different cybersecurity strategies that are going to need to be implemented depending on the entity involved, whether it's government, private sector, depending on that industry. Peter, I wonder if you might provide to us sort of a general overview of what is in fact Canada's cybersecurity strategy?
Sure. Thanks, Avi. Yeah, when we asked ourselves the question around what is cybersecurity in the context of setting out to a cybersecurity strategy. And one of the principles behind it, in any event, was the idea that cybersecurity is not in and of itself an end. It's cybersecurity is a means, from a government perspective, it's a means of maximizing the potential benefit for society. In our case, for Canada, all the possibilities, all the opportunities that the cyberspace affords, and our use of digital technologies affords. So obviously, I don't need to tell the crowd here that the cyberspace is enormously fundamental to all our lives. Whether it's economic, whether it's social, cultural, political, it pervades everything, and it's the underlying foundation for everything we do in modern society. So, for government, activity in this space was really about cybersecurity was one tool, albeit a very important one tool for being able to maximize those benefits for all of Canadians. And in terms of governing our activities and our strategy for ensuring cybersecurity in the country, our strategy is set up to focus on three key areas. We call them pillars. So the three pillars of our strategy. The first one is all around protecting the government's own infrastructure, its own networks, and for a variety of reasons, that's an incredibly important task. Not least of which is that Canadians trust us with their information. Canadians trust us with their security, and our ability to protect their information and protect Canadians depends on our ability to have robust and secure networks. So, protecting our own house was one, and it is the first pillar of our cybersecurity strategy. The second pillar is focused externally. It's focused outwards, and it's focused on the private sector, on critical infrastructure owners and operators, and on provinces, territories, and municipal governments, other jurisdictions. And the reason is quite simply because at the end of the day, somewhere around 80 to 90%, it'll differ in every country, but in I'd say 80 to 85% of the infrastructure that we actually care about and that we rely on for our day-to-day activity in the country is actually not in the federal sphere. It's controlled or owned by other jurisdictions or the private sector. So all those organizations have a responsibility for ensuring the robustness and the security of their networks. The government's job is really about facilitating or helping those constituents secure their networks and create an environment in which they're in a position to make their infrastructure as cyber secure as possible. So there's a whole host of activities that we undertake under that pillar when we engage with the private sector and other levels of government. We'll probably end up talking about those a little bit later, so I won't go into the detail now. But that is a critically important part of our strategy, and it has been. We've been placing particular emphasis on that over the last couple of years as we've moved forward. The third pillar of our strategy is also externally focused, but it's focused on individual Canadians. And the reason that is so important is at the end of the day, there's 35 million Canadian users of the internet. I think the most recent survey had pretty much 100% of Canadians online at least once a day, and the average time online was something about 40 hours a month, so nearly 2 days a month. Almost every single Canadian spends online. That's a lot of vulnerability points across the country. The numbers around awareness on cyber hygiene, good cyber practices, are staggeringly low. There's a lot that needs to be done around the general awareness of what the cyber threats are for individual Canadians, and to teach folks what they need to know themselves better online and ensure that they have a secure experience and don't create vulnerabilities for the people that they're online with, whether they're companies or other individuals. So those are, at a high level, the three pillars of our strategy of activity that we've decided to focus on in the Government of Canada.
Thanks, Peter. So we're talking about the critical infrastructure that is of course affected, that is protected through cybersecurity. United States and Canada, of course, share a physical border and a digital border. I wonder, Catherine, perhaps you could speak a little bit about how that affects the critical infrastructure in terms of shared critical infrastructure that the United States and Canada have.
Sure, thank you, Avi. When I think of the critical infrastructure, as I see the different nation states starting to define what they, within their own domestic regulation, feel are the necessary private and owned and operated entities that need securing and protecting in order promote and maintain their national security and their economic viability on the world market. I think about critical infrastructures with three, so countries disagree, there are some commonalities among identifying the sectors, but there are kind of three characteristics that describe what critical infrastructures are for nation states. First, I see them as a symbolic, it's a symbolic, of symbolic importance and power for the state. So that's kind of, we don't want to minimize the importance of protecting those, even if it's for those symbolic reasons. There's also, though, a degree and immediacy of dependence on the infrastructure itself for the functioning of the society. And I'll talk about about four of the sectors, both to Canada, but also the United States, where we have interconnectedness and interdependency. And the last characteristic is that the known and unanticipated effects of the complex dependencies of the critical infrastructures that will have consequences beyond just the local consequences for the nation state that houses these sectors, that they'll cross borders. Structures, they tend to be those that operate of the sectors, of the different private sector. The critical infrastructure are those that tend to operate on global markets. So that's key to recognize first. And therefore, the international connectivity is basically critical and indispensable to their business interests. So that's kind of first and foremost why the nations have put critical infrastructure as a priority in terms of protecting them from the cyber threats. So there are, in the critical national infrastructures, both for the U.S. and Canada, there have been four sectors in particular that have key interdependencies across the borders. There's the energy and utilities sector, the transportation, the finance, and then the ICTs themselves, which cross over all of those sectors. Canada, of course, has a national security policy on securing an open society that was published in their national strategy for critical infrastructure. Hopefully Peter can talk a little bit about those that came out in 2010. The U.S. has equivalent strategies identifying the sectors, what needs to be done to protect them. Been recognized, though, by all governments is that the primary responsibility for protecting these critical infrastructures are the owners and operators, which all exist in the private sector. But because of the interdependencies, both within a domestic arena, but also across the infrastructure sectors themselves and across national jurisdictions, there has to be this public-private sector partnership, which many states are working diligently on and figuring out the best model for which to solve these problems. There has been much talk in terms of support from the government, what can be when it comes to helping the private owners and operators in the critical infrastructure. And some have suggested, though we're not there yet, that while the government has limited responsibility and legal authority to actually sit on the networks and protect them, they, one, could regulate, which is favorable when it comes down to discussions from the private sector. And recent legislation that was proposed in the U.S. has shown that. It was blocked. This was the CISPA legislation Mike Rogers put forward. But there are other roles for the government, including what has been suggested, kind of sharing government revenue, meaning incentivizing the private practice by actually giving them money to help them secure their systems. The U.S. is not as far leaning as that as yet. I think that we're not too far out. There are constraints, and it comes up mostly in the information sharing arena about what the government can do in helping the critical infrastructure. Maybe we'll talk about that a little later, but there's constitutional, legal, jurisdictional constraints. There's also resource constraints. The government, believe it or not, at least in the U.S. government, I think in other governments, they don't have unlimited resources. There's also source protection issues that they worry about, sharing may be classified, how to get that out, and then liability issues. Bringing it back to Canada, though, what's very important for the Canada-U.S. relationship on this is that, for instance, just taking the energy sector as one of the critical infrastructure. Canada's energy sector is very closely the U.S. At a continental level. Any of the major any major supply disruptions that would have a profound effect not only on the Canadian consumers but also on the export markets in the U.S. And the U.S. has recognized that. And that's why has been very keen and has been working with the Canadian government. So as we increase, the essence of it, as you increase the connectivity, it means that the failure of one critical component is liable to have the far-reaching, reverberating effects, even across the infrastructure sectors themselves. And therefore, we get to a time where what the government is looking at is how do you build a comprehensive situational awareness of these problems. I'm going to come back to this later when we talk about the role of intelligence. I come from the intelligence community and have been a long proponent of thinking preventively, not just reactively. And there is a key role that the government and Canadians' intelligence service, as well as the U.S., has played a part and will continue in trying to build that situational awareness for the private sector and the infrastructure. Other examples on the critical infrastructure that tie Canada and U.S. particularly together are there's pipeline networks, the electricity grids, and there's extensive commercial interaction, actually, among the critical infrastructure owners and operators across the borders. Canada, and as an example, Canada is the single largest international supplier of oil and natural gas to the U.S. So you can imagine if Canada suffered an attack against their critical infrastructure, particularly on the oil infrastructure, it would not just devastate Canada and local consumers, but clearly the United States as well. That good enough kind of map it as
that's really helpful. Scott, can you still hear us?
Yes, I sure
good.
can.
Good. Well, I wonder if you might step in. Catherine talked about models that and structures that might govern cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, and what have you. I know that you have written on the National Institute Standards and Technology Framework and how that might address some of these issues concerning Canada and the U.S. Perhaps you could speak about that.
Sure, no, I'd be happy to. But just first, though, thanks for the introduction, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you guys today. I just wish it could be in person. I have to apologize as well because there's a protest going on outside in Freedom Square here in Tbilisi right now. So I hope it's not too noisy and they don't destroy any critical infrastructure in the process. But it kind of explains the bad internet connection. So it's a really good question. There's a lot of different models of critical infrastructure protection out there and a lot of different ways to classify it. In the U.S., we have, it looks like 16 sectors that we've settled on, but that really varies around the world. Often it's in the eye of the beholder, which is something that we've already been talking about a bit. It's a common problem. So getting to the NIST framework through the back door, a few co-authors in my survey of 34 national cybersecurity strategies last year. And all these strategies we found talked about critical infrastructure protection as being vital to a nation's cybersecurity, which was the area of convergence that we found. Only 2/3 talked about cybercrime and even less about governance. So I think there's a common perception that this is a big deal. A lot of these strategies mentioned information sharing and private sector collaboration as kind of the paths forward. But there was a lot less agreement on the need for new laws, at least in these strategies. Only 20% talked about the need for new regulation, which I think kind of shows some of the attractiveness of this voluntary bottom-up approach like we see in the NIST framework that you mentioned, Professor Culver. And to those who aren't familiar with it, this NIST framework, this was called for from an executive order by President Obama back in 2013. It came out a little over a year ago now, and this is a framework of cybersecurity best practices designed for critical infrastructure operators with a lot of private sector buy-in. It's only a year, but it's already having an impact. In fact, some think that it's already helping to shape a standard of cybersecurity care, really these critical infrastructure sectors. So it's worth paying attention to, not only here in the U.S., but NIST is also collaborating with lots of other countries. So policymakers in the UK, Japan, Korea, Israel, Germany, Australia, Estonia, and from what I understand, Canada have all been actively involved in the future stages of this. And we have NIST kind of version 2.0 being worked out right now. I just wanted to mention too that there are very different approaches out there than we have. China, for what it's worth, has a ranking system where they rank critical infrastructure from 1 to 5 in terms of importance. In the EU, one of their more recent cybersecurity strategies, they look much more broadly at pretty much companies that have some nexus to e-commerce. It's going to depend on how each nation implements these kind of policies, but that's a very different approach. And some nations like Singapore are experimenting with hybrid approaches that kind of find a middle ground, especially dealing with the active defense of critical infrastructure. So Singapore, they just passed a new law that permits the governmental issuance of certificates that direct specific persons to prevent, detect, or counter threats to critical infrastructure. So there's lots of different models out there, but I definitely think the NIST framework is one that's worth paying attention to.
Thank you, Scott. So talking a little bit, keeping that in mind and keeping David's admonition sort of at the outset, that there are, of course, different spheres that we're talking about and how the regimes may apply differently if you're dealing with private sector, if you're dealing with military, if you're dealing with defense. I want to talk a little bit about international norms in this area and where we are going. And I'd leave it to the panelists to, if you want to focus on either aspects that are dealing more with the private enterprises or are dealing with government. I think in 2012, the former State Department legal advisor Harold Koh had talked about sort of a applicability of international humanitarian law to cyberspace, defining to some degree or trying to determine, when there is an attack. But I wonder, Catherine, perhaps you could start us off talking a little bit about where we're going on some of these international consensus on some of these issues.
So kind of starting from a high-level discussion, before I get into kind of international law per se and the rules, that some of which already exist and others that are in dispute as to whether they're applicable in the cyber domain, it's useful to start thinking about how the laws ultimately under international relations, they get developed through some kind of agreement about what are acceptable norms, right? The normative development of principles, basic principles and values. And what we're seeing going on globally right now when we talk about what are the rules of the road for particularly for state behavior in cyberspace, and what are the rules that already exist maybe under international law, whether it's the jus ad bellum, use of force, or laws of armed conflict. What we're really talking about, though, is how do you develop a consensus about social norms in the virtual world? And that's where we're seeing a divide, and it could be split a number of different ways among the countries, but typically you'll see the Western liberal democracies, and it's split there on one side. And some of this discussion has come up at the UN, which I can talk about that process that I've been involved with in terms of negotiating norms with now about 20 states. That's one place, one forum, but there's also been regional discussions, and we have in the Netherlands, there's the World Summit that's coming up on cyberspace in April. There are a lot of different forums and arenas where states are gathering at very high levels to talk about what are those rules of the road. But the reason why we see this split, though, is fundamentally about a disagreement about social norms in the virtual world. China, Russia, a number of other states have developed their proposal, have put it forth at the General Assembly. They've recently updated it with the Code of Conduct, and they approach this from a very different normative understanding about values and principles, most of which is about, and even coming back to what David said about the language itself, the words, they will use the words like information security and not cybersecurity. And their when you look through it, and what the U.S. has been opposed to that document is because it's about censorship, because they fundamentally don't believe that there is a right of free speech, and there is no First Amendment when it comes to cyberspace, particularly in their domestic jurisdiction. They would like to block and censor. And the U.S. is different, right? The U.S. is based as well as Canada and others. Canada is actually was on the UNGGE. This round of the 20 states, Canada is not a member anymore, but very much involved in kind of putting forth the social ideas and principles and values in which the Western liberal democratic countries are very different from the eastern part of the world. Mainly, you see China and Russia on one side, and the U.S. and allies on the other side. But so if you understand it comes from a disagreement about what those social norms are, can we transplant it from the physical world into the virtual world? There's a lack of a. Now, when it comes to international law, it's not just some kind of normative values that you're promoting, but there has been a discussion. It's been going on for a number of years. One location, of course, is at the UN. It started in 2004 when the Secretary General of the UN said, we need to kind of have a world summit and thinking on ICTs. So the UN group of government experts, which the U.S. has been a member of, Canada as well, started in 2004 convening to get agreement on what those rules would be. Originally, it had nothing to do with use of force and conflict issues, but in 2013, their report that was released and is available, and that came out of their meeting that year, actually, for the first time, had in their report that the General Assembly accepted that international humanitarian law is applicable in cyberspace, that the UN Charter is applicable in cyberspace, that the norm of state responsibility is relevant in cyberspace, and I'm only mentioning a couple of the parts, but the parts that are relevant to the laws of international law, and that proxies should not be used by states. These were some key agreements by then 15 states, which had the cyber powers in that group, China and Russia and the U.S. Enlarged to 20, makes for negotiation and agreement more difficult, especially when we have now Jamaica in that group, which has kind of made it a little more complicated as to what their role and value is in that group. But expanding it, I think, is critical for the development and the socialization of these international laws. But even Russia and China have seemed to be walking back from that 2013 document. In the past year and a half, they have made statements in various places that they actually didn't mean the laws of armed conflict. Importantly, LOAC was never mentioned in that document. For some in the U.S., the negotiator, Michelle Markov from State, that was representing the U.S., she thought that it was implied. But lawyers, being lawyers, when you read that document, and I mentioned what's not said is often more important than what is said. And by mentioning the UN Charter but not mentioning LOAC, that's a significant point. And it looks like China and Russia are walking back from the applicability of Geneva and Hague Conventions in the cyber domain. So that's why watching the Ukraine, what's happening there, I told my students and talked to the government people about this, is very important. The Tallinn Manual, I don't want to forget to mention some great work by international legal experts. Although this document that was written and published by Cambridge University Press, it's not a binding legal treatise. No state has signed up to it. In fact, states have said, well, we don't necessarily agree with all of it, but it is a significant piece of work, one that I recommend anyone if you're wondering about what international laws are applicable or may be applicable in the cyber domain. They basically split that document among jus ad bellum analysis and jus in bellum. Mike Schmidt from the Naval War College was the managing director. They're now working on Tallinn 2, which will be very interesting because they are to be focusing on things that were not addressed in Tallinn 1, which go below the use of force level, dealing with some very controversial issues of what is an intervention in cyberspace, what is a violation of sovereignty in cyberspace, and that is still contentious. Whether there is a such concept in cyberspace is not agreed to yet. So while we have some beginnings of some agreement about applicable law that already exists, I would have to say the story is more negative than I would hope, that there is no general consensus. At least there's no international consensus. And even among the cyber powers, there seems to be disagreement. So we have a lot more work that has to be done. I think we've started it, but it'll be a long time, I think, before we get, and I don't think there'll be any time where we will get an international treaty on this subject. I think if anything, it'll be an agreement that already existing laws are applicable with some tweaking at the edges to make them more appropriate in the cyber domain. But I don't think we'll have like a written multilateral or a universal treaty that outlines every single aspect. As the Tallinn Manual experts say, what we will see develop in law will depend on state practice, as all international law is based on. You need to watch, we'll have to keep watching, and that's why the Ukraine right now is current state practice that you'd want to be watching on both sides, how the Ukrainians and the Russians are using the cyber domain in this context of a regular physical conflict.
Thank you, Catherine. So shifting slightly, Peter, I want to get you back into this discussion, just specifically perhaps discussing some of the ways in which the U.S. and Canada are working together, specific concrete initiatives.
Sure thing, yeah. We heard a little bit this morning about just how deep and how fruitful the collaboration is between Canada and the United States, and that extends, of course, into the security domain, the military domain. We've got decades and decades of friendship and collaboration, and so it's no surprise, of course, that this is extended into the cyber domain as well. As cyber became more of an issue, had more visibility, it was taken on increased importance. Policymakers on both sides of the border have been working together to improve how we collaborate. I think the first, the first manifestation, at least at a strategic level, of the desire to collaborate on cyber was in the context of the Beyond the Border plan, which was mentioned earlier this morning. The kind of the more practical and concrete manifestation of that is, or at least one of them anyway, is the Department of Homeland Security and Public Safety Canada Cybersecurity Action Plan. And under that, there's a number of areas in which we're working together. Operational collaboration is a big one. So we are the United States has more operational centers than Canada does, but our operational capabilities, we work together regularly on a day-to-day basis. We're sharing information. We're developing cyber threat information products that we share with private sector together. In many cases, those are even co-branded. We're doing a lot of that, building a lot of that connective tissue between different but similar, whereby we're sending analysts down to work with their American counterparts for time, and the Americans are sending analysts up to us, and that's been going on for years now. So we're really building the relationships between our operational centers and working together to not just to share information, but also to manage cyber incidents. Another area we're working together is our doing more joint work around how we engage the private sector and what information we share with the private sector. We all, this was alluded to earlier by Catherine, we all have operators who've got a presence on both sides of the border, so it only makes sense that we're actually aligned. The two governments are aligned with how we engage those operators, but also what we tell them in terms of what we pass on in terms of cyber threat information. So there's a lot of work going to coordinate a lot of that messaging and a lot of that engagement program with the private sector, particularly with critical infrastructure operators. The third area that we've identified for practical cooperation under the Cybersecurity Action Plan between the two departments has been around awareness campaigns. So in Canada, we get Cyber Safe awareness and education campaign, and in the United States it's called the Stop, Think, Connect campaign. We've done a lot of work to leverage each other's materials, products, so a lot of that joint work has been very valuable, but also a lot of work in terms of aligning our messaging to our populations and aligning our thematics around, particularly around those signature profile events that happen throughout the year. October, as I'm sure many of you know, is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and so there's a lot of work between our two countries to align our messaging, align our thematics, so that the messages that are being shared with our populations are consistent and complementary. So that's under the Cybersecurity Action Plan between the two departments that have overarching coordination responsibility for cyber. Beyond that, we also do a lot of work internationally with the U.S., not just the U.S., but also our Five Eyes partners. So from an operational perspective, there's a ton of operational collaboration that takes place with the Five Eyes. The forum is called the U5, and it meets regularly to share best practices, to share cyber threat information, and just generally kind of cooperate, improve cooperation on how we manage cyber incidents. And of course, there's also a deep collaboration on cybersecurity policy, which takes place between Canada and the U.S., but also in that international forum with the Five Eyes allies, and in wider fora such as the OAS, the Organization of American States, the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, and other processes like the Meridian process, the April Dutch conference that Catherine alluded to. So the cooperation broad, it's deep. We still have a lot of areas that we're working to improve, but we've come a long way over the last 6 years, and it's been a very fruitful relationship.
Thank you. So I think everyone, in one way or another, David, maybe you crystallized it sort of best, our reliance on our devices, our private company-promoted devices, So I want to get a little bit into, what is the role of the state? What is the role of the private sector? How do they interact? Is there any inhibition of free enterprise by, too much government involvement? Perhaps, David, you could lead us off with that.
Sure. I want to start by pointing out something which I think is also often lost in the cybersecurity discussion, in part because we call it that. We call it the cybersecurity discussion, which instantly brings our mind to thinking about people typing on their computers and trying to hack in that way. That's not the entire component or the entire aspect of protecting information systems. For most of the organizations represented here, it's likely that your greatest vulnerability is physical access control to your building or the business processes surrounding your technical access controls. For example, I won't ask you to raise your hands, but think in your heads how many of you have ever forgotten your password and had to reset it. That is a tremendous attack vulnerability. Former vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin's personal email account being one of the more notable examples. That's how it was compromised. So when we think about what oftentimes is called information security, to follow through on Catherine's comment, we need to think about not just technical, but also physical and what is called in the NIST framework administrative risks to defend against. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to link back in answering the question of the role of the public and private sectors working together, to Catherine, to something that you said, which you pointed out that there are many examples recently of regulation being viewed unfavorably. And this is a problem because it's very, very difficult for the public sector to effectively override what ultimately become market pressures in the absence of regulation. So there's been a whole series of economic studies. For those interested, look at the workshop on the economics of information security, the conclusion of which is, at least right now, the market can't compete on better security, even in the financial sector. So what then are we left with? Well, we need some form of regulation when the market fails. Even Milton with this. So how becomes the question? Well, it turns out that regulation is not always viewed unfavorably, but for reasons I haven't yet fully figured out, although I'm working on it. The best example I know of private sector information security regulation was also the most favorably received by the industry, which is in the United States, the Healthcare Information Security Rule, or the HIPAA Security Rule. Now, this is different than the HIPAA that most of you in the United States may be familiar with, where you have to sign all these forms, and if you're a medical practitioner, it slows down the operation of your hospital, et cetera, et cetera. This is different. This is about making sure that the systems which are used to share and store very sensitive medical information aren't subject to compromise. So, for example, attempting to prevent repeats of the incident, I believe it was the late 80s or early 90s, when computer systems at Sloan Memorial Kettering were compromised, and the hackers had the ability to change dosing for cancer treatment patients. It's a very easy way to kill someone. What happened in the development of these regulations, which started in the very late 90s and concluded in 2003 and 2005, is a congressionally established group, which had existed for about 64 years, to write regulations for healthcare generally, and was supervised by the relevant regulatory agency, but comprised no voting members of the committee were from the regulatory agency. They were all from the private sector and other constituencies like consumers, and in the United States, in this case, the states themselves were also consumers. And these 15 or so people in the subgroup managed the entire rulemaking process that was otherwise formed to the standard rulemaking process. Now, why is this important and why is this interesting? Two things. First of all, they acted against their self-interest. There are direct quotes from the meeting minutes where you'll see senior executives, representatives of large organizations saying, we already do this, and if we layer on this compliance process, it's going to cost us a lot more. But we want to write a good rule because we know if we don't do it, the folks down the street are going to be where the point of compromise is, and it's going to hurt us. Now, where's a non-healthcare example of that you've all probably heard of? They weren't compromised because their security was bad. They were compromised because one of their vendors' security was bad. And although they haven't released all the information, I'd be willing to bet that they did have an agreement in place with that vendor saying that vendor was supposed to use good security. There's something to this. And there's something empirically to it. The result of this particular framework was that for the year 2000 through the end of 2010, you can show empirically that healthcare, finance also because it had a similar framework in place, were 4 times preventing reportable breaches than all other industrial sectors. So the takeaway I suggest is that there are models for regulation where, at least in the cybersecurity context, given all of the interoperability and all of the reasons why organizations are incentivized to get a regulation right, that a public-private partnership can come up with a regulation on which they agree and for which there will be an industry buy-in.
Scott, I wonder if you could follow up on some of David's comments about the public sector, private sector roles to play in cybersecurity.
Certainly, yeah, and I absolutely agree with what David was just saying there. Obviously, there's a lot that the public and private sectors can learn from one another here, and that doesn't happen enough, right? Information sharing is a buzzword, of course, these days. That's often not a two-way street. That's one of the critiques, obviously, from especially the Valley here. Some of the best information sharing, at least that I've kind of run into, when speaking with engineers at Google and elsewhere, are through cyberstotal.com, right? Which engineers use to kind of spread information about cyber threats and best practices and build trust networks much more organically. So I think we are seeing the beginnings of some more active collaboration there, like with the NIST framework, but I think we need to do more still to take a more proactive stance, right? It's important to build in this case, these best practices from the start and don't after the fact in a more kind of reactive fashion. As David was saying, the market always doesn't incentivize that kind of behavior, but that might be changing as we start to see more managers and more folks even in the C-suite start to suffer from some of this stuff. Just thinking through the bottom up, I'll just mention a few examples. It's obviously critical supply chains for both the public and private sectors. Microsoft did a study where they found malware actually being installed on PC production lines before they even leave the factory. That's a tough starting point, right? It's also critical to address protocol vulnerabilities. The domain name system itself that matches IP addresses with website names, right? That's inherently insecure. There's a partial fix out there called DNSSEC, but plenty of companies haven't implemented that. At a kind of broader level, it's really critical to cybersecurity hygiene campaigns for employees and managers. The U.S. has tried to do some of this public education. October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. I won't ask for a show of hands, not only because I can't see of how many people were aware that October was Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We haven't done a particularly good job of communicating some of these best practices, whether it's for each of us as individuals or for organizations in terms of technological or budgetary best practices. So to get at some of that, I'll just finish by mentioning that we did a survey with a few co-authors out at Hoover last year where I was based, looking at how companies are marketing kind of these proactive cybersecurity products and services. I looked at 26 companies, and all but one of them, the biggest area of convergence was on the idea of penetration testing and cybersecurity auditing, which might be partially in response to the growth of the insurance industry here. But I think we are seeing some more definition of best practices, a lot less along the lines of mobile security or services designed to counter insider threats. Only a few companies offered anything along those domains. But I think the private sector really is driving some of the discussion here and developing some of the most innovative best practices. And I wouldn't say that it's up for the government to, require that by any stretch of the imagination. But through policies like the NIST framework, I think maybe we can start to build those industry norms that then could percolate up. And who knows, at the end of the day, maybe they will be required. I'll just finish by saying that I think it's important to note that, this is part of an overarching discussion about the role of the public and private sectors in internet governance more generally. And I don't think we'll have time necessarily to get into it, but it's something that is just worth paying attention to because it's a hot topic right now.
Thank you, Scott. So mindful of the time, I'd like to open up to questions in the audience. Perhaps right over here. Do we have a mic?
I have the microphone. I have two brothers who work in this field managing information networks, and I was wondering, because one of them says there is no internet security, and so he believes that in his company. Could hacking be reduced if there was an international treaty that provided for extradition of hackers, or for deportation to like North Korea or maybe like Georgia? I mean, we don't really hear, except once in a while in an FBI context, of hackers getting caught or severely treated about that. We go after bank robbers and they get $2,400 and they get maybe a mile down the road and then they're caught. So why aren't we catching and severely treating these hackers?
Sure. Would someone like to handle that first question about the consequences for hackers?
Well, I'll mention something about the
Yeah, go
law.
ahead.
Just so I've often, when you said about I think it was your brother, you said that there is no internet security. I actually am one with that. And that's why we have this complex problem that all the way up to the highest levels of governments now are determining what's the best policy. I always think that I talk to my students. I think you can have there are three things that come up in discussion a lot, and you only can pick two. Can't have all three. Often the conversation is about freedom, security, and convenience. And so I say you can only have two of those. So pick. A lot of times what we're seeing is the convenience seems to be really important for people, and therefore you have to trade off your security or your freedom. But like all complex problems, there's a saying, forget who said it, all
Probably might need a lower level. So the question is in terms of how secure do we need to be?
Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. I'd agree completely with what David just said. If I was to add to it, I guess I'd simply add as well, one, to answer the initial question, that there's no such thing as complete security. That's not going to happen. But two, you'd be surprised just how secure you can get if you follow some pretty basic things. A lot of countries, governments put out top 10s or top 30s or top 4s or top X number of activities you can undertake to secure yourself against cyber threats if you're an organization, you're running an IT infrastructure for an organization. And on almost all of those lists, if you do the top 3 or 4, you're covering off about 80% of your risks. That's a big chunk, and so you can, if you've done that right, you can focus your energies on that last 10% or 20% or whatever the residual is. And so you'd be surprised just how secure you can become if you follow some pretty basic steps. So total security is totally out of the question, but to the point about kind of how secure do you want to be, and this goes to the other point that Catherine made around convenience. There's various approaches you can take to make yourself as secure as is reasonable for your organization.
Scott, I wonder if you have anything to add there. I know you've talked about cyber peace and perhaps how that fits in within this question.
Sure, no, absolutely. Yeah, I first read about kind of this end game, what's the best we can hope for in terms of cyber peace, in a report that came out a couple years ago called the Quest for Cyber Peace. That was put out by the World Federation of Science at the Vatican. And from what I remember, that defined cyber peace, at least in part, as something like a universal order of cyberspace built on a wholesale state of tranquility, which, sounds great, but I share kind of some of the skepticism that that's just not all that likely. So I put this question to actually folks I was interviewing for the book that I wrote that came out last year that's actually subtitled In Search of Cyber Peace. And one of the guys that I quoted, I think, might have a good insight here. That's Michael Dubose, who was the former head of the Department of Justice Cybercrime Division. He told me cyber peace would be an entire weekend without my BlackBerry going off, which I kind of like, actually, because that to me as well, I don't think we're going to reach the end of cyber attacks, but we can maybe build toward a more positive vision that makes them less likely. that, in the process respects human rights, spreads internet access along with these cybersecurity best practices, and strengthens multi-stakeholder governance mechanisms, with the idea being that even if we can't stop cyber attacks, we can certainly manage them more effectively by taking a networked and distributed approach to a networked and distributed problem, in the words of Robert Nackey. So just a quick aside there.
Thank you, Scott. So we are really past time, I think, at this point. So please just give an expression of thanks to our panelists. Lunch is across the hall. You may want to now go change your email and internet passwords.
Yeah, Michael, if you want my cards, we didn't.
I'd love to have my students actually read anything that you're working on.
Happy to.
And
Thank you,
I'd love to
guys.
share some
Thank you,
of the
Scott. I'll hang up.
Thank you.